The movie opens with a military transport truck rolling out of the highly classified Area 51, carrying sealed containers under heavy armed escort. The convoy moves steadily across the desert, but even the soldiers guarding it seem unaware of what they're transporting. Their casual conversation makes it clear, whatever is inside those containers is above their clearance level. At the same time, far away from the tension of the convoy, a newly married couple is enjoying the first moments of their life together. The atmosphere is light, joyful, and carefree. The bride, full of excitement, playfully distracts her husband as he drives, and he becomes so caught up in the moment that he stops paying attention to the road. In a split second, the car drifts out of its lane, and before he can react, it slams directly into the military truck carrying the mysterious cargo. The crash throws everything into chaos. Soldiers rush to secure the scene, and the commanding officer urgently contacts headquarters. The response is immediate and alarming. They are instructed to stay away from the containers at all costs. But before any further instructions can be followed, something inside one of the containers begins to move. Without warning, the container bursts open. A horrifying figure emerges, a zombie. Within moments, the creature attacks the nearby soldiers, spreading the infection rapidly. The situation spirals out of control as the infected begin turning on the rest of the convoy. What started as a controlled military transport turns into a full-blown outbreak. From there, the infection spreads like wildfire, eventually reaching Las Vegas. In a shockingly short time, just a single night, the vibrant city filled with millions is completely overrun. The government attempts to contain the outbreak, but the speed of transmission makes it impossible. The entire city collapses into chaos, becoming a massive zone of the undead. With no other option left, authorities seal off Las Vegas entirely. Massive shipping containers are stacked to form a towering barrier around the city, trapping every zombie inside. The outside world is cut off, and the city is effectively abandoned. Months pass. During this time, the government prepares a final solution. Plans are announced to eliminate the threat by dropping a low-yield nuclear bomb on the city, wiping everything out once and for all. Elsewhere, a former soldier named Scott Ward learns about this impending strike. Not long after, he is approached by a wealthy casino owner, Mr. Tanaka, who presents him with a risky but highly rewarding opportunity. Tanaka explains that inside one of the casinos in Las Vegas, there is $200 million locked away in a vault. With the city scheduled for destruction, he wants Scott to retrieve it before it's too late. The offer is simple but dangerous. Assemble a team, enter the city, break into the vault, and bring back the money. In return, the team will be allowed to keep $50 million. Meanwhile, inside a refugee quarantine camp located just outside the container wall, a woman named Gita speaks with Scott's daughter, Kate. Gita asks Kate to look after her children, revealing that she plans to sneak into the city herself to recover money left behind. She intends to do this with the help of Lily, a border guard who has been secretly allowing people to cross into the restricted zone. At the same time, Scott is haunted by a painful memory. In a dream, he relives the moment he had to kill his own wife after she turned into a zombie, a decision that still weighs heavily on him. After wrestling with his past and the risks ahead, Scott finally accepts Tanaka's mission. He begins assembling a crew of specialists. First, he recruits Maria and Vander, both former elite soldiers he trusts in combat. Each of them is promised $15 million, the same share Scott will take. Then comes Peter, a skilled helicopter pilot, offered $2 million. Next is Guzman, a flashy zombie-hunting YouTuber who agrees to join for $500,000. Dieter, a quirky but brilliant safecracker, is brought in for $250,000. The remaining funds are reserved for contingencies. With the core team in place, they gear up stocking weapons and equipment suited for surviving the nightmare waiting inside the city. The following day, Guzman arrives with 2 additional members, his friends Damon and Chambers, expanding the group further. Soon after, Mr. Tanaka outlines the mission plan in detail. Once inside the city, they will fight their way through the undead and reach the casino. Peter will head to the rooftop to prepare the helicopter for extraction, while the rest of the team escorts Dieter to the vault. After cracking it open and securing the money, they will regroup and escape via helicopter. However, there's a catch. Tanaka assigns one of his own men to accompany them, ensuring that no one walks away with more than their agreed share. And most importantly, they only have 1 day to complete the mission before the nuclear strike wipes the city off the map. That night, Scott approaches Kate and asks for her help to gain entry into the quarantine zone. He offers her $15 million, hoping it will convince her to assist him and to secure a better future for the children at the camp. Kate, who volunteers there, has connections that could make crossing possible. The next morning, the team boards a transport bus and heads toward the quarantine camp. Upon arrival, they meet Lily, the guard who will guide them into the city. But tensions rise quickly when Kate realizes that Gita, the woman who asked for her help, has already entered the city ahead of them. Furious, Kate confronts Lily and lashes out physically. Lily, caught off guard, explains that she had no idea Gita had children depending on her. She had simply allowed her through, unaware of the full situation. Determined to fix things, Kate insists on joining the mission to find Gita. Scott refuses at first, wanting to protect his daughter from the dangers ahead. But Kate stands her ground, threatening to go into the city alone if he doesn't let her come. Faced with no other choice, Scott reluctantly agrees. Now, with the team assembled and the stakes higher than ever, they prepare to enter the dead city where time is running out, and survival is far from guaranteed. As the team prepares to cross into the Suja zone, Lily makes one more request. She insists that Bert be added to the group, claiming she'll need his assistance once they're inside. Though hesitant, Scott agrees, and with that, the full team finally steps beyond the barricade and into the dead city. The moment they enter, the silence feels unnatural, heavy, suffocating. Then suddenly, a deep, thunderous roar echoes through the streets. Everyone freezes. Out of the shadows emerges a massive, decaying tiger, its eyes lifeless, its presence terrifying. Panic ripples through the group, fingers tightening around triggers. But instead of attacking, the creature simply strides past them, uninterested, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The team exhales, shaken but alive. Not long after, Lily quietly approaches Bert and asks for his weapon. Without suspicion, he hands it over. But in an instant, everything changes. Lily raises the gun and shoots him in the leg. Chaos erupts. Maria immediately assumes betrayal, accusing Lily of turning on them. But Lily remains calm, explaining that this was necessary. According to her, the city isn't just filled with mindless zombies anymore. There are evolved ones, smarter, more organized, known as alpha zombies. And to pass through their territory safely, a sacrifice must be offered. Her choice of Bert wasn't random. She reveals that he had a history of abusing women inside the quarantine camp, something she hadn't forgotten. The team is forced into a grim decision. Reluctantly, they accept her reasoning. Soon after, the Alpha presence makes itself known. A regal female figure, the zombie queen, arrives, accompanied by a towering bodyguard. Without hesitation, they take the injured Bert and drag him away. Inside a dark building, Bert regains consciousness, only to find himself surrounded by alpha zombies. The tension builds until a powerful figure steps forward, their leader, the Zombie King. With a brutal act, he transforms Bert into one of them, completing his initiation into the alpha ranks. Meanwhile, Scott and his team continue deeper into the city. To reach their target, they must pass through an abandoned building filled with dormant zombies, hundreds of them, lying motionless like corpses frozen in time. It's a trap waiting to be triggered. With no alternative route, Scott carefully guides the group through, marking a narrow path between the sleeping bodies. Every step is calculated, every breath feels too loud. But then, everything goes wrong. Martin, Tanaka's man, deliberately tosses away the glow sticks marking the safe path. Chambers, walking at the rear, loses sight of the route and drifts off course. As she tries to correct herself, she accidentally brushes against one of the bodies. The effect is immediate. The entire room begins to stir. Chambers fights desperately, cutting her way through as the undead awaken around her. But just as she tries to escape, Martin seals the exit, locking her inside with the horde. Guzman, realizing something is wrong, demands answers, but Martin plays ignorant, pretending he has no idea what happened. Moments later, Chambers bursts through a window, badly injured but still fighting. Surrounded and with no way out, she locks eyes with Guzman and tells him to run. With no other option, Guzman shoots the fuel she's carrying, igniting a fiery explosion that consumes her along with the swarm. The team is shaken, but they press on. Reaching the casino, Scott quickly assigns roles. Peter and Maria head for the rooftop to prepare the helicopter. Martin and Lily remain outside to monitor the perimeter. Meanwhile, Vander, Dieter, and Guzman move toward the vault, while Scott and Kate go to restore power by activating the generator. Everyone splits off, racing against time. Outside, Lily and Martin deliberately provoke the appearance of the zombie queen. As she approaches, Martin makes his move, attempting to capture her. But her bodyguard reacts instantly, charging at him. In the chaos, Lily intervenes, taking down the guard with a precise shot. At first, it seems like she's helping Martin, but the truth is darker. Martin reveals his real intention. He doesn't want blood samples for research. He wants the queen's head. His goal is to use it to engineer controllable undead soldiers, an army he can command. Realizing she's been manipulated, Lily warns him. If the zombie king discovers what they've done, their earlier sacrifice and any fragile peace will mean nothing. Inside the casino, Scott and Kate manage to restore power, bringing the building back to life. Elevators hum again, lights flicker on. Peter and Maria rush upward, taking the lift to the rooftop. Vander, Dieter, and Guzman push forward toward the vault. Upon arrival, they encounter resistance, zombies lurking within the area, but after a fierce fight, they clear the room. To access the vault, they blow open the outer barrier. But the real challenge lies within hidden traps designed to kill intruders. To bypass them, they lure zombies into triggering the mechanisms, sacrificing them to safely deactivate each deadly obstacle. Once the path is clear, Dieter steps forward. This is his moment. With intense focus, he begins working on the vault, carefully manipulating its complex locking system. Meanwhile, on the rooftop, Peter runs into trouble. The helicopter isn't in working condition. Critical components are damaged. As he attempts to fix it, things get worse. The engine sparks and suddenly, flames erupt. The team's escape plan is already falling apart. And then, the worst news arrives. As they check the outside world through a broadcast, they learn that the president has moved up the nuclear strike. They no longer have a full day. They have even less time than they thought. The update hits like a punch to the chest. There's no full day anymore. The nuclear strike has been moved forward, leaving them with barely 90 minutes to finish everything and get out alive. The pressure instantly skyrockets. Scott and the others rush toward the vault room, but their sudden arrival disrupts Dieter right in the middle of his delicate work. The distraction forces him to reset the entire sequence, costing them precious time they can't afford to lose. With nothing else to do but wait, the team begins gathering loose cash scattered throughout the building, quickly stacking and sorting it so they can divide it later. Every second feels heavier than the last. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, Dieter cracks the final lock. The vault door swings open. Inside, mountains of cash. For a brief moment, the tension breaks. Smiles appear. Relief washes over them. But Scott snaps everyone back to reality, ordering them to start bagging the money immediately. They have less than an hour now, no time to celebrate. What Scott doesn't realize is that Kate is no longer with them. While everyone was focused on the vault, she slipped away on her own mission to find Gita. Elsewhere in the city, the zombie king discovers the lifeless body of the queen. He carries her back to his lair, and when he realizes that the unborn child she carried is gone, something inside him snaps. His grief turns into pure rage. Without hesitation, he summons his entire army and directs them toward the casino. Back at the vault, Scott notices Kate is missing. Panic sets in. He decides to go after her, with Maria joining him, but just as they reach the elevator, the undead flood in. The attack is sudden and brutal. Maria is overwhelmed and killed before Scott can save her. Fighting through the chaos, Scott manages to push back a few of the attackers, but the situation is collapsing fast. As he searches for an escape route, the worst betrayal unfolds. Martin seals them inside and walks away, abandoning them completely. Trapped, the remaining team scrambles for a way out. Vander fires up a chainsaw, carving through walls in a desperate attempt to create an exit. As they struggle to hold off the advancing horde, the zombie king himself appears. He moves with terrifying speed and strength. Bullets bounce off his armored helmet, rendering their shots useless. Left with no choice, Vander charges him head-on, engaging in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. The king overpowers him, closing in for the kill, but at the last second, Dieter intervenes. In a selfless act, Dieter shoves Vander into the vault and sacrifices himself, holding the king back long enough for Vander to survive. Outside, Martin prepares to leave with what he believes is the queen's head. But Lily has already outplayed him. She secretly swapped it with a money-counting device. Just as Martin realizes he's been tricked, the zombie tiger emerges and tears into him, ending his escape in a brutal instant. Meanwhile, Scott, Lily, and Guzman manage to break free from the vault area and head for the rooftop, where Peter is supposed to be waiting with the helicopter. But the undead are closing in fast, forcing them into another intense fight. During the chaos, Guzman is bitten. He knows what that means. Without hesitation, he pulls every grenade on his body and detonates them, creating a massive explosion that clears a path for Scott and Lily to escape. They finally reach the rooftop, but the nightmare isn't over. The Zombie King has followed them. With no other option, Lily pulls out the Queen's head and uses it as leverage, threatening the King to hold him back. She urges Scott to get on the helicopter immediately. But the King doesn't hesitate. He launches a spear that pierces straight through Lily, killing her instantly. As she collapses, the Queen's head slips from her grip, falling off the building and shattering on the ground below. At the same time, deep within the city, Kate finds Gita held captive in the King's territory. She frees her, and they attempt to escape, but their path is blocked by the transformed Bert. Now an alpha, he attacks without mercy. Kate fights him off and manages to kill him, but the noise draws the King and his remaining forces. A final battle erupts as Kate and Gita struggle to survive against overwhelming odds. Somehow, they manage to hold their ground until only the King remains. Just as he prepares to strike, Scott arrives. He fires a grenade launcher, blasting the King back and buying them enough time to escape. Together, they rush toward the rooftop. For a moment, it seems like Peter has abandoned them, but then the helicopter returns, swooping in just in time to rescue them. They board quickly, but they're not alone. The Zombie King, still alive, leaps onto the helicopter mid-flight. A brutal struggle unfolds inside the aircraft. Scott fights him desperately, but during the clash, he's bitten. Summoning his last strength, he manages to kill the King with a final shot to the head. And then, the sky lights up. The nuclear strike begins. The explosion sends a shockwave that violently destabilizes the helicopter. It spirals out of control and crashes. When Kate regains consciousness, the silence is devastating. Peter and Gita are dead. Only she and Scott remain. But Scott is already changing. The infection is taking hold. Realizing what's about to happen, Kate makes the hardest decision of her life. She raises her gun and pulls the trigger. The blast echoes, ending her father's life before he can turn. Elsewhere, beneath the ruins, Vander, who had been locked inside the vault, somehow survives. He eventually breaks free and escapes the destroyed city. After wandering for some time, he finds a working vehicle and drives away, carrying bags filled with hundreds of millions of dollars. His nightmare, it seems, is finally over, or so he thinks. Later, aboard a private jet, Vander begins to feel unwell. Dizzy, disoriented, he stumbles into the bathroom. As he checks himself, he notices something chilling, a bite mark. The infection had been inside him all along, and with that realization, the story comes to a haunting end. Las Vegas doesn't fade quietly. That's the first thing you need to understand about Army of the Dead. This is not a story about a city slowly disappearing. It's a story about the most excessive, most theatrical, most deliberately artificial place on Earth being overtaken, completely and catastrophically, by something it never expected. And there is a strange poetry in that. A city built on spectacle, undone by the ultimate spectacle. A city where everything feels manufactured, overwhelmed by something disturbingly, overwhelmingly real. On paper, and I want to be clear about this, Army of the Dead has one of the strongest blockbuster premises in recent memory. Not just for a zombie film, for any film. The concept is sharp, the setting is inspired, and the genre blend it promises is exactly the kind of bold, creative swing mainstream cinema needs more often. The question we're going to spend a lot of time with, is what the film actually does with that premise. But before we get there, we need to understand what that premise is. It begins on a stretch of Nevada highway, somewhere between the scorching desert and the glittering skyline of Las Vegas. A military convoy moves with clear purpose, classified cargo, secured escort, and the kind of official urgency that tells you immediately whatever is inside that truck was never meant to be seen. The convoy has recently departed from Area 51. The payload, as one soldier quietly explains, is dangerous enough that even military-grade force may not be enough if things go wrong. Things go wrong. A collision. A civilian vehicle, a pair of newlyweds, of all people, in entirely the wrong place at entirely the wrong time, crosses paths with the convoy on a highway that should have been secured. The containment vessel cracks open, something steps out, and within hours, Las Vegas is no longer a city. It is a quarantine zone. The government responds quickly. Massive barriers rise around the strip. The outbreak is contained, not resolved, contained, and the nation watches from a safe, comfortable distance as Sin City becomes the most dangerous square mile on the planet. Thousands of infected, a sealed perimeter, and a government that has decided, with bureaucratic certainty, that the cleanest solution is also the most dramatic one. They're going to erase it with a nuclear strike, and that is where the story truly begins. Because before the countdown reaches zero, someone notices something. $200 million. Cash, sitting untouched in the vault beneath a Las Vegas casino, sealed inside a city that is about to cease to exist. And the man who owns that casino has no intention of letting it disappear in the blast. His name is Bly Tanaka, played by Hiroyuki Sanada with the kind of calm, quietly intimidating authority that makes you trust him just long enough to regret it. Tanaka approaches a man named Scott Ward, mercenary, former soldier, survivor of the original outbreak, played by Dave Bautista, with a proposition that is either the opportunity of a lifetime or the last decision someone ever makes. Go in, get the money, get out before the countdown reaches zero. Do that, and 50 million of the 200 belongs to Ward and whatever crew he can assemble. The rest goes back to Tanaka. Simple, clean, extremely risky. Ward takes the deal. He assembles a team, a rough collection of mercenaries, specialists, pilots, and opportunists, and they prepare to enter a city the rest of the world has already abandoned. A city that is, by this point, no longer anything resembling what it once was. But here is the detail the premise quietly hides, the detail the film reveals gradually, and the one that changes everything about the mission. Tanaka is not being fully honest. There is another agenda beneath the polished surface of this transaction. Something he wants from inside those walls that has nothing to do with the money. And whatever it is going to complicate the operation in ways Scott Ward never agreed to and cannot fully prepare for. A zombie outbreak, a ticking clock, a vault full of cash, a billionaire with secrets, and a crew of people who, if we're being generous, have every qualification for this job except the most important one, the ability to agree on what the job actually is. That is the premise of Army of the Dead. And I want you to sit with it for a moment. Really sit with it, because it deserves that. A zombie heist film set in a quarantined Las Vegas against a nuclear countdown with betrayal built into the foundation. That is a great idea. That is the kind of idea that, in the right hands, becomes a classic. The kind of idea that creates sequels, merchandise, and cultural conversation for years. The table is set. The ingredients are extraordinary. Every element is in place. What happens next? What the film does with this magnificent, high-voltage, high-concept premise is the conversation we are about to have. And I promise you, it is a complicated one. But before we dig into what works and what doesn't, we need to talk about the man who made it. Because with this director, nothing exists in isolation. Before we say a single word about zombies, about Las Vegas, about heists or vaults or nuclear countdowns, we need to talk about the man behind the camera. Because with Zack Snyder, the filmmaker is never separate from the film. He is part of the conversation. He is part of the debate. And whether you walk out of one of his movies satisfied or frustrated almost always comes down to the same question you brought in with you. How do you feel about Zack Snyder? That's not criticism. That's simply the reality of being one of the most divisive directors working in mainstream cinema today. Snyder is, at his core, a visual maximalist. A filmmaker for whom the image is everything. Who thinks in slow motion, who composes frames the way painters build canvases, whose command of spectacle is, at its best, genuinely unmatched in modern blockbuster filmmaking. When Zack Snyder creates a memorable image, it stays with you. It settles into the back of your mind and remains there. But here's the tension that has followed his entire career, the space between the images, the story, the characters, the logic that carries you from one breathtaking frame to the next. That has always been where Snyder's filmmaking becomes more complicated, and that complication has never fully disappeared, no matter how many films he has made. Army of the Dead did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in the immediate aftermath of Zack Snyder's Justice League, the legendary Snyder Cut, a 4-hour director's vision that had been denied release for years and finally reached audiences in early 2021. For a significant part of the film community, that release was vindication. Proof that Snyder's ambitions, given enough room to breathe and enough creative freedom to execute, could produce something genuinely impressive. The fan response was enormous. The momentum heading into Army of the Dead was real. And beyond that, this wasn't Snyder stepping into unfamiliar territory. His 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead remains, to this day, one of the most respected zombie films of the modern era. Lean, tense, tonally precise, a film that balanced dark humor with sustained suspense. He had already proven he could handle the genre and handle it exceptionally well, so the expectation going into Army of the Dead wasn't just optimism, it was informed optimism. The director had credibility, the genre suited him, the timing was ideal. And that is exactly why your personal history with Snyder becomes the lens through which this entire film is viewed. Those who admire him, who accept the trade of visual grandeur in exchange for tighter narrative clarity, will find enough in Army of the Dead to justify the investment. The signature slow motion, the operatic framing, the sheer commitment to scale. It's all here, and for a certain kind of viewer, it is exactly enough. You don't watch a Zack Snyder film expecting a tightly engineered screenplay. You watch it to be visually overwhelmed. And on those terms, he delivers. But for viewers who need their stories to hold together, who need characters with genuine inner life, who need filmmaking craft to extend beyond the frame and into the logic of what is happening within it, Army of the Dead presents the same recurring issue that has followed Snyder throughout his career. He is, as a pure visual filmmaker, exceptional. As a storyteller, he remains persistently, almost defiantly, less interested in the fundamentals that make stories resonate. And here is the part that makes all of this worth saying. Snyder doesn't change. He doesn't reshape himself to satisfy critics or reduce his instincts to meet convention. For better or worse, what you see is exactly who he is. Army of the Dead is not a departure, it is a confirmation. Every strength on display is a strength he has always had. Every weakness is one he has always carried. What changes, what has always changed, is not the filmmaker. It is how much patience you bring into the theater. If you've made peace with Zack Snyder, if you've accepted him on his own extraordinary, frustrating, visually impressive terms, there is real enjoyment to be found here. But if you arrived hoping that this time, with this much creative freedom and this much budget and this much goodwill behind him, he might finally close the gaps, Army of the Dead will feel like a very familiar kind of letdown. So let's begin where the film begins, with one of the most debated opening sequences in recent blockbuster memory. There is a specific kind of disappointment that only great premises can create. Not the disappointment of a bad idea executed badly. That's just failure, and failure is easy to process, easy to move past. No, I'm talking about something far more frustrating. The disappointment of a great idea. A genuinely, undeniably great idea that arrives with every advantage imaginable, every ingredient correctly measured, every condition perfectly aligned, and then somehow, systematically, almost defiantly, refuses to become what it so clearly could have been. That is the disappointment of Army of the Dead. And I want to be precise about this because precision matters here. This is not a film that didn't know what it wanted to be. This is not a film that lacked ambition or resources or talent or opportunity. This is a film that knew exactly what it was holding, exactly what it could do with it, and still, at almost every critical juncture, chose the lesser option, took the safer road, reached for the easiest payoff when something far more memorable was sitting just slightly higher, entirely within reach. That is not bad filmmaking. That is something more frustrating. That is wasted filmmaking. There is a moment early in Army of the Dead, a small moment, almost throwaway, that functions, intentionally or not, as the film's most honest self-portrait. One of the crew members carries a buzzsaw, a massive, roaring industrial tool that promises, from the second you see it, some of the most spectacular chaos the film could possibly offer. Your imagination runs ahead of the movie. You start building the scene in your head, the mayhem, the scale, the over-the-top cinematic payoff that a tool like that, in a film like this, practically demands. The buzzsaw remains, for nearly the entire film, inexplicably clean. All that promise, all that potential, carried through the story without ever being fully unleashed. And when you step back and look at Army of the Dead as a whole, at the distance between what this film promised and what it ultimately delivered, you realize the buzzsaw is not an accident. It is a metaphor. It is the whole movie summarized in a single prop. Let's talk about what was on the table, because it matters to understand exactly what was left unused here. $90 million. Netflix backing, which in practice means creative freedom at a scale most filmmakers never come close to. A director returning to the very genre he had previously proven he could master. His 2004 remake of Dawn of the Dead still stands as one of the finest modern zombie films. A premise so perfectly engineered it almost writes itself. A zombie heist set in a quarantined Las Vegas against a nuclear countdown, with hidden motives buried in the foundation, and an ensemble cast assembled with obvious care and ambition. Every variable was favorable. Every condition was right. The runway was clear, the engine was running, and the destination was something genuinely special. And then the film taxied endlessly and never quite lifted off. The tragedy of Army of the Dead is not that it is a bad film. It isn't, not exactly. It has real pleasures, and we'll get to all of them in time. The tragedy is the persistent, accumulating, impossible-to-ignore sensation that you are watching a film actively sidestep its own best instincts. It mistakes length for depth, stretching to nearly 2.5 hours while saying considerably less than a tighter, more disciplined 90-minute version of itself could have said. It mistakes noise for tension-filling action sequences with scale and volume while generating very little genuine suspense. It mistakes a great setting for a great story, placing its characters in one of the most visually and thematically rich locations imaginable, and then treating that location as expensive wallpaper. Las Vegas, quarantined, crumbling, hauntingly beautiful, uniquely American in its excess and performance, is handed to this film on a silver platter. The themed casinos. The iconic architecture. The singular, almost surreal identity of a city built entirely on theater and illusion, now overtaken by something that makes all of that performance meaningless. That is not just a setting. That is a story. That is a character. That is an entire creative universe waiting to be explored. Army of the Dead walks right past it, barely glances at it, uses it as backdrop and moves on. And this pattern repeats itself, again and again. Throughout the film, the alpha zombies, intelligent, emotional, hierarchical, capable of something resembling love and grief, are introduced as a major shift in zombie mythology. The ambition of that concept is real, and we'll examine it in detail later. But the film gestures toward it, circles around it, and never fully commits to exploring what it means. Ideas are introduced and then sidelined. Storylines are opened and never properly resolved. Characters are assembled with clear intention and then given almost nothing meaningful to do. The film introduces robotic zombies, and then barely acknowledges the concept again. This is not world building. This is a film filling its plate at the buffet and leaving most of it untouched. One reviewer described it in terms that have stayed with me ever since. What should have been a giant feast of fun, thrills, and spectacle becomes a strangely forgettable and low-energy experience full of unused talent, potential, and ideas. And that, in all its frustration, in all its genuine bewilderment at the gap between concept and execution, captures something very real about the experience of watching Army of the Dead, because the concept deserved better, the setting deserved better, the genre deserved better, and perhaps most importantly, the audience, who arrived with genuine excitement and genuine goodwill, deserved considerably more than a film that spends 2.5 hours almost becoming what it was meant to be. Here is the question Army of the Dead leaves you with, long after the credits roll and the nuclear dust settles. What went wrong? Not in a dismissive sense, not as a rhetorical setup for complaints, as a genuine, sincere, almost melancholy question. Because the problem here is not the problem of incompetence or indifference. The problem is that of a film that had everything, and still could not close the gap between its ambition and its achievement. A master chef, an extraordinary kitchen, the finest ingredients money can buy, and the meal arrives lukewarm, under-seasoned, plated without care. The vault was there. The money was inside. They just couldn't open it. Every film has a moment of first impression, a sequence, sometimes only a handful of shots, that tells you exactly what kind of experience you are about to have. It declares intent. It establishes the contract between filmmaker and audience. It says, this is what I am, this is what I can do, and this is the experience I'm promising you. The opening of Army of the Dead is, without qualification, one of the finest first impressions Zack Snyder has ever put on screen. And I want to stay with that for a moment. Genuinely stay with it before we get into the controversy that follows. Because the controversy is real, and it matters, and we are absolutely going to discuss it. But it would be dishonest and frankly unfair to let the debate around the credits sequence overshadow what the film accomplishes in its opening minutes. Because what it accomplishes is remarkable. And in a film that will spend the next 2 hours struggling to match its own potential, those opening minutes represent the clearest, most concentrated expression of what Army of the Dead could have been, if only it had sustained that energy across its full runtime. It begins with economy and precision, a military convoy on a Nevada highway moving with that specific official urgency that immediately signals classified cargo and high-level stakes. 2 words, Area 51, are dropped into dialogue so casually they almost pass unnoticed. Almost. The payload, we're told, is dangerous enough that conventional military force may not be enough. The soldiers carry the quiet discomfort of people who know something they wish they didn't, and then a civilian vehicle drifts across the center line. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong everything. The collision is swift, intense, and spectacularly staged. The containment vessel breaks open. Something steps out of the wreckage. And within the space of a single, magnificently choreographed sequence, Las Vegas falls. The soldiers who survive the crash are turned. They climb a hill. They look toward the city. And we understand, without a single additional line of exposition, exactly how completely everything has changed. This is Snyder at his most purely cinematic storytelling through image, movement, and the precise orchestration of sound and spectacle into something that lands with real force. It is sharply detailed, visually striking, and executed with the kind of confident, unhurried control that only a filmmaker fully in command of the medium can deliver. For those few minutes, the promise of Army of the Dead feels entirely, thrillingly real. And then, the credits begin. And for a significant portion of the audience, everything that follows in that sequence is pure enjoyment. The title sequence of Army of the Dead is, on its own terms, a genuinely spectacular piece of filmmaking, set to a musical backdrop that is simultaneously unexpected and perfectly chosen. It presents a heightened theatrical vision of Las Vegas being overtaken zombie showgirls stumbling through casino floors infected, Elvis impersonators moving down the strip, large-scale chaos rendered with a wink and a grin that says very clearly, we know exactly how absurd this is. And we have committed to it completely. It is visually inventive in ways the body of the film only occasionally matches. It is tonally bold in ways the body of the film often struggles to sustain. It establishes a visual language, excessive, stylish, darkly comedic, completely unashamed of itself. That is precisely the language this film should have spoken for its entire runtime. The slow motion is used here with a confidence and purpose that justifies every criticism ever made about its overuse elsewhere. The music lands, the imagery lands, the tone lands. If the film had simply matched the energy of its own opening credits for 2.5 hours, we might be talking about something extraordinary. But, there is a but, and it is not a small one. Somewhere in the middle of that gorgeous, kinetic, brilliantly assembled credit sequence, something happens that one part of the audience will experience as a creative masterstroke, and another part will experience as a structural misstep. And the debate between those two positions is, I would argue, one of the most interesting conversations this film creates. The credit sequence shows you characters dying, not unnamed background casualties of the outbreak, specific characters. Characters who, at the moment the credits are rolling, have not yet been introduced in the narrative. Characters whose eventual exits later in the film's second and third acts are clearly intended to carry emotional weight, dramatic consequence, and genuine surprise. Except you have already watched them fall, in the credits, before you even know their names. Now, let's be fair to both interpretations of this decision, because both readings are valid, and neither is simply wrong. The case in favor of it goes like this. Snyder is making a deliberate structural choice, a non-linear declaration that says the destination is not the point. The journey is the point. We know these people are not making it out. We know, from the moment we meet them, that they are walking toward an ending they cannot avoid, and that foreknowledge does not reduce the drama, it deepens it. It transforms the film from a survival story into something closer to tragedy. Every light moment carries extra weight because we already know what lies ahead. Every relationship gains a reflective quality it would not have if we assumed survival remained possible. That is a genuinely interesting artistic argument. And if the film had been fully constructed to take advantage of that foreknowledge, if it had used the dramatic irony it created to generate tension and emotional resonance throughout, it would be a defensible, even admirable, choice. The case against it is equally compelling, and ultimately, I think, more persuasive. The problem is not that the deaths are shown. The problem is when they are shown and how the film handles the consequences. When you watch a character fall in the opening credits, before that character has been given a name, a voice, a personality, or a relationship with anyone else on screen, what you are seeing is not dramatic loss. You are seeing an image of loss. You are seeing spectacle without stakes. Because stakes require attachment. Attachment requires time. And time is exactly what the credit sequence does not provide. The film cannot have it both ways. It cannot use the credits to borrow the emotional shorthand of tragedy and then expect those same moments to land with full dramatic force later in the narrative. Emotional economy doesn't work that way. You cannot spend the currency before you've earned it. And there is a further complication. One, several viewers noted with real confusion. The scenes shown in the credit sequence do not appear in the main body of the film. They are not excerpts from scenes you later revisit in fuller context. They are unique to the credits themselves, created specifically for that sequence, existing only there, disconnected from the narrative that follows. Which raises a question the film never answers. What are they for? Are they deleted moments that never made the final cut? A visual prologue existing outside the story's timeline? A stylistic flourish prioritizing aesthetic impact over narrative clarity? Possibly all three. Possibly none of them. The film does not say. And its refusal to say is either fascinating ambiguity or revealing avoidance, depending, once again, on how generous you are feeling. What is not in dispute is the practical effect it had on certain viewers. If you did not know going in that the credits sequence contained character deaths, if you sat down expecting a conventional opening and instead found yourself watching people you had not yet met being removed from the story, the experience was for many disorienting enough to cast a shadow over everything that followed, not because the sequence was poorly made, but because the contract it implied was not the contract the film ultimately delivered. Here is where I land on it personally. The opening sequence of Army of the Dead is brilliant. It is confident, inventive, visually spectacular, and tonally precise in ways the rest of the film struggles to sustain. As a standalone piece of filmmaking, it deserves genuine admiration. The credits controversy is real, and the structural questions it raises are legitimate, but those are the questions of a film that was at least trying, that was reaching for something unconventional, something pushing against the comfortable architecture of a standard genre opening. That the reach exceeded the grasp is disappointing. That the reach was attempted at all, in a film that too often plays things safely, is worth acknowledging. The opening of Army of the Dead is a 5-minute argument for what this film could have been. The controversy around it is a reminder of how difficult it is to honor a great idea with execution worthy of it. Both things are true, and both things matter. There is a question serious film criticism has wrestled with for as long as cinema has existed as an art form, and it is a question Army of the Dead brings back into sharp, uncomfortable focus. How much control is too much? At what point does a filmmaker's complete command of their own vision stop being a strength and start becoming a limitation? At what point does the removal of outside perspective, the collaborator who pushes back, the second eye that sees what the director cannot because they are too close to it, produce not freedom, but a very expensive, very elaborate blind spot? On Army of the Dead, Zack Snyder did not simply direct the film, he photographed it. He served as his own cinematographer, designing the visual language, controlling the camera, making every decision about light, lens, and framing at the same time he was making decisions about performance, pacing, and story. It is an unusual choice for a filmmaker operating at this scale. It is a choice with real creative logic behind it. And it is a choice that produces results so simultaneously impressive and frustrating that it becomes, in miniature, the story of the entire film. Let's begin with what the dual role creates at its best. Because at its best, it creates something genuinely rare. When Snyder is both the person deciding what a scene should feel like and the person deciding what it should look like, the result can be seamless in a way traditional director-cinematographer partnerships sometimes are not. There is no translation layer, no moment where an instinct has to be explained, interpreted, and then executed by another creative mind. The vision moves directly from thought to lens. And in the sequences where that directness pays off, the action set pieces, the slower atmospheric passages, the moments where the film's visual ambition and dramatic ambition briefly align, the results are striking. The action scenes in Army of the Dead are confidently staged and beautifully lit. There is a spatial clarity to the strongest of them, a sense that the camera always knows where it is in relation to the movement, that every cut is motivated, every motion purposeful. The confrontations have weight because the photography gives them weight. The framing is not decorative. It is dramatic. It does not merely record events. It interprets them. And then there is the slow motion. Snyder's use of slow motion is one of the most discussed, debated, imitated, and often parodied techniques in modern blockbuster filmmaking. It is his signature. It is his trademark. It is, for supporters, a poetic tool. A way of stretching time so the audience can inhabit a moment more fully, feel consequence more deeply, and experience impact in a way real time cannot always provide. And for critics, it is an indulgence, a stylistic habit deployed so frequently it risks becoming self-parody. In Army of the Dead, slow motion appears throughout. And here, more than in many of his recent films, the argument in its favor is surprisingly persuasive. The opening sequence, which we discussed in detail earlier, uses slow motion not as decoration but as architecture. The stretched, almost balletic quality of the chaos in those opening minutes is doing something specific and earned. It imposes operatic form on what would otherwise be pure disorder. It says, "Look at this, really look at this, understand what this moment costs." In that context, slow motion is not indulgence, it is craft. It is a filmmaker using technique with clear intention and achieving a result that justifies the choice completely. In other parts of the film, the quieter character scenes, the slower midsection passages, it shifts from craft into habit. And that is an important distinction. The difference between a technique used with purpose and a technique used simply because it is familiar is the difference between style and mannerism. Army of the Dead lands on both sides of that line, sometimes within the same scene. But if slow motion is a technique that works more often than it doesn't, there is another photographic choice in Army of the Dead that drew far more consistent criticism. And that, I would argue, is the clearest example of what happens when total creative control becomes a liability. The shallow focus. Snyder, acting as his own cinematographer, repeatedly uses extremely shallow depth of field throughout the film, pulling focus to isolate a single element in the frame while everything around it dissolves into soft, painterly blur. It is a technique with genuine artistic pedigree. Used well, shallow focus can create intimacy, guide attention with surgical precision, and give a scene a dreamlike dislocation that serves certain stories beautifully. There are moments in Army of the Dead where it works exactly as intended. The desert sequences, where heat haze and visual instability reflect the environment, benefit from it. Certain moments where something unsettling exists at the edge of the frame, half seen and half suggested, become more effective because of it. But Snyder returns to the technique so frequently, so reflexively, and so broadly that it stops feeling like a deliberate choice and starts feeling like a signature applied regardless of whether it serves the moment. There are action scenes where characters and threats at the edges of the frame are rendered nearly invisible by blur, not because that invisibility creates tension, but because the camera is simply doing what it always does. There are dramatic conversations where focus shifts in ways that pull you out of the scene rather than deeper into it, because your eye becomes more aware of the technique than the emotion the technique is supposed to support. And this is where the dual role question becomes genuinely important. When a director works with a separate cinematographer, when the visual language of a film is shaped through creative conversation rather than one uninterrupted perspective, there is a built-in check to the process. The cinematographer can say, "This is too much. The shallow focus is distracting us from the scene. The slow motion here is working against the pacing. Let me show you what this scene looks like without it. That conversation matters. The filmmaker benefits from it, even when, and especially when, it is uncomfortable. When the director is also the cinematographer, that check can disappear. The conversation becomes internal, and internal conversations, no matter how talented or disciplined the person having them, often carry a familiar blind spot, the tendency to love your own ideas too much to challenge them. The shallow focus in Army of the Dead is, in too many scenes, an example of a filmmaker becoming enamored with an effect without a collaborator present to ask whether the effect is serving the film or merely serving itself. To be fair, and fairness requires saying this, the dual role also creates something most mainstream blockbusters rarely achieve, a genuine, consistent, unmistakable visual point of view. Army of the Dead does not look like a film made by committee. It does not look like a film whose visual identity was designed to be safe, neutral, and broadly acceptable. It looks like a film made by a specific human being with specific aesthetic convictions, for better and for worse. In an era where blockbuster visuals increasingly blend together, where franchise films are often designed to feel interchangeable, there is something genuinely valuable about a movie that looks like nothing else currently being made, even when some choices miss the mark. Even when the shallow focus distracts and the slow motion edges into self-imitation. The film has a face, it has a perspective, it carries the unmistakable quality of having been made by someone who cares deeply, and sometimes recklessly, about the image. That is rarer than it should be. And it deserves acknowledgement even inside criticism. There is one area where Snyder's total visual control produces results that are, by near universal agreement, exactly right. And that is the film's commitment to unapologetically intense, R-rated horror imagery. This is a filmmaker who, given complete control over how the horror is presented, does not soften it. The creature effects are bold, inventive, and entirely unashamed. The action encounters are staged with a craftsman's instinct for maximum impact. The makeup and practical effects work is photographed with the kind of close, detailed attention it deserves, near enough to feel unsettling, wide enough to feel cinematic. Mainstream cinema has, for much of the last decade, moved away from this kind of fully committed, blood-soaked genre filmmaking in favor of the commercially safer PG-13 register. Army of the Dead, under Snyder's complete visual authority, rejects that trend entirely. And for genre fans, for viewers who have spent years watching zombie films toned down by ratings concerns, there is something almost cathartic about seeing a filmmaker who simply refuses to compromise on that front. It is, without question, one of the film's greatest pleasures. And it is a pleasure that exists directly because of the dual role, because Snyder, as his own cinematographer, answers to no one when he decides a particular moment needs to be shown in full detail. There is no studio executive in the room. There is no separate visual collaborator with a different instinct for restraint. There is only a filmmaker, a camera, and a complete commitment to showing exactly what he wants the audience to see. In those moments, the dual role is not a liability. It is liberation. So what is the final verdict on Snyder as his own director of photography? The honest answer is complicated. Deeply, irreducibly complicated. The dual role creates some of the film's greatest strengths and some of its most persistent frustrations, sometimes within the same sequence, sometimes within the same shot. It gives the film a visual identity that is unmistakable and occasionally stunning. It gives it a commitment to mature horror that feels genuinely refreshing. It gives it slow-motion sequences that, at their best, are operatic and emotionally effective. It also gives it a shallow-focus obsession that too often works against the drama it is meant to support. It removes the creative friction that collaboration naturally provides. It means that when Snyder's instincts lead somewhere less effective, there may be no one in the room positioned or willing to redirect him. Total control is a magnificent thing in the hands of a filmmaker whose instincts are always right. Zack Snyder's instincts are not always right. They are frequently brilliant, occasionally transcendent, and reliably, fascinatingly, sometimes wildly his own. Army of the Dead is the product of all of that, every frame of it. Now let's talk about something the film genuinely, unambiguously, and almost defiantly gets right. Because in a review that has spent considerable time and will spend considerably more examining the gap between what Army of the Dead promised and what it delivered, it would be not only unfair but actively dishonest to ignore the areas where the delivery is complete, where the promise is not merely honored but exceeded, where the film looks you directly in the eye and says, "Whatever else you think of me, you cannot deny this." The visuals of Army of the Dead, the zombie design, the practical makeup work, the CGI, the post-apocalyptic rendering of Las Vegas are, taken together, some of the most impressive genre craftsmanship put on screen in years. Not impressive for a Netflix film, not impressive for a zombie movie. Impressive, full stop. Impressive by any standard you choose to apply, and they deserve to be discussed with specificity and genuine admiration. Start with the environment, because before a single zombie appears, the world Army of the Dead builds around them is already doing extraordinary work. The quarantined Las Vegas of this film is one of the great post-apocalyptic settings in recent cinema. Not because it is the most technologically advanced rendering of urban decay, though it is technically strong, but because it understands something fundamental about what makes a ruined space cinematically powerful. It is not destruction itself that resonates. It is the contrast between what was and what is. Las Vegas, more than almost any city on Earth, is defined by excess, its noise, its relentless, aggressive, artificial vitality, a city that never sleeps, never quiets, never allows a moment of stillness. Strip that away, remove the crowds, the sound, the lights, and what remains is something almost unbearably melancholy. Sand drifting across casino floors that once held thousands of people. Neon signs, half buried, still flickering with the ghost of their original message. The architectural grandeur of the Strip, the pyramids, the towers, the fountains, standing intact and empty, magnificent in a way they perhaps never were when full. Snyder, as his own cinematographer, captures this environment with a photographer's understanding that decay and beauty are often twin qualities rather than opposites. The ruined Las Vegas of Army of the Dead is haunting in ways that go beyond the requirements of the genre. It feels, in its best moments, genuinely elegiac, a mourning for something that was garish, excessive, chaotic, wonderful, and is now simply gone. And then the dead arrive, and the film shifts from elegiac to extraordinary. The zombie design in Army of the Dead represents, without exaggeration, some of the finest creature work in the genre's long and distinguished history of making the human form unsettling. These are not the familiar shambling, gray-faced, vaguely humanoid undead of convention. These are creatures, specific, detailed, individual creatures whose design reflects real creative investment at every level. The makeup work is, frankly, stunning. Each zombie carries the visible history of its own transformation, the texture of decay at a particular stage, the way flesh appears differently depending on environment and time, the small disturbing details that reward close attention in ways fully digital creature design rarely does. You can see the craftsmanship in these faces. You can see the hours of application, the layers of prosthetics, paint, and texture that went into creating each one. This is the work of artists who take the genre seriously, who understand that a zombie is not just a costume but a character, and that the difference between a memorable zombie and a forgettable one often comes down to the specificity of design. But the design work does not stop with the standard infected. It extends, ambitiously and impressively, into the film's visual separation between different categories of undead. And this is where the design team's creativity becomes most obvious. The standard zombies, the rank and file of the Las Vegas horde, are rendered with the grimy, sun-bleached quality you would expect from creatures that have existed in desert conditions for years. They are weathered, dried in places, swollen in others. They carry the specific quality of bodies left to the indifferent forces of time and climate. They are unsettling because they are specific, because the design does not reach for a generic image of horror, but for something that feels disturbingly tangible. The alpha zombies, the intelligent, hierarchical undead occupying the film's upper tier, are something else entirely. Their design is elevated in every dimension, more physically imposing, more visually striking, more deliberately composed in presentation. Where the standard undead are chaotic and deteriorating, the alphas carry a dark coherence. Their movements are deliberate. Their physical presence is intimidating in a way that goes beyond size. It is the presence of intention, of something not merely reacting, but actively deciding. The contrast between these two visual registers, The degraded disorder of the Horde and the dark, almost regal authority of the Alphas is one of the film's strongest examples of visual storytelling. It communicates hierarchy without dialogue. It reveals the social structure of this zombie civilization through design alone. That is craftsmanship of a very high order. Now, the CGI. This is where the assessment requires nuance that blanket praise or blanket dismissal would both fail to provide. Because the CGI in Army of the Dead is not uniform, it ranges from seamlessly integrated to noticeably artificial, sometimes within the same sequence, and that distinction matters. At its best, the CGI work here is genuinely impressive, used to extend practical environments, to create scale beyond what physical production could achieve, and to realize larger set pieces with the grandeur the film is aiming for. The wide shots of the Horde, thousands of undead moving through the ruins of Las Vegas with terrifying collective momentum, are effectively realized. The scale feels real. The threat feels immense. The CGI animals, and we will discuss the zombie tiger in much greater detail later because it absolutely deserves its own segment, are rendered with varying degrees of success. The tiger, in particular, is impressively executed. Its movement feels weighted. Its physicality feels convincing. Its integration into the live-action environment is strong enough that it rarely breaks immersion. The zombie horse ridden by the Alpha King is somewhat less convincing, a digital creation that never fully achieves the tactile presence of its feline counterpart. Where the CGI most obviously strains is in certain background elements, digital extensions of environments that, in close-up, feel dimensional and convincing, but in wider shots occasionally reveal the smoothness associated with digital construction. These moments are not frequent enough to become seriously damaging, but they are there, and in a film whose practical effects work is so strong, the contrast can occasionally be jarring. Beyond creature design and CGI, it is worth taking a moment to discuss the film's broader visual palette because it is a deliberate and largely successful form of visual communication. Army of the Dead operates in a color language that is both rich and strategically muted. The ruins of Las Vegas are rendered in dusty golds and bleached whites, the colors of desert heat and abandonment, which contrast sharply with the deep reds of the film's action imagery and the cooler blues used in its night sequences. It is a palette that signals desolation without becoming visually exhausting, a difficult balance to strike, and one the film maintains with real skill. The lighting, across both the exterior desert scenes and the interior casino sequences, reflects Snyder's complete command of his environment. The casino interiors, lit by the remaining glow of emergency systems and the scattered light of whatever natural illumination reaches inside, have an atmosphere that is both familiar and deeply wrong. These are spaces designed to be full of people, noise, and the manufactured cheerfulness of the gambling industry. Empty, lit only by the ghost of their former brightness, they become profoundly unsettling in ways elaborate horror staging could not improve upon. There is one sequence, quiet, nearly wordless, taking place as the crew first enters the quarantine zone that deserves particular attention. As the team moves through the outer perimeter of the city, the camera slows down. It lingers on details. A playing card half buried in sand, a slot machine still cycling combinations no one will ever pull, a wedding chapel whose sign still advertises 24 HOUR ceremonies to an audience that no longer exists. These are small details. They likely cost very little to include, and they are worth more in terms of atmosphere and world building than any amount of large-scale digital spectacle, because they are specific. Because they tell you something real, not about zombies, but about the city that existed before the zombies. About the particular, irreplaceable strangeness of Las Vegas as a human project. About what exactly was lost when the walls went up. This is visual storytelling at its most efficient and most effective. And its presence in Army of the Dead is a reminder that Zack Snyder, when his visual instincts align with genuine dramatic purpose, is capable of work that moves well beyond spectacle into something genuinely meaningful. The visuals of Army of the Dead are, in the final analysis, the film's most consistent and most fully realized achievement. The zombie design is exceptional. The post-apocalyptic environment is hauntingly beautiful. The practical makeup work is among the finest the genre has produced. The CGI, while uneven, is largely effective and occasionally genuinely impressive. And the film's broader visual language, Its palette, its lighting, its composition reflects the work of a filmmaker with an extraordinary eye, operating with total creative authority in the domain where that authority is most productive. If Army of the Dead were a silent film, if you stripped away the dialogue, the story, the characters, and the narrative logic, and simply watched the images, you would be watching something close to a masterpiece of genre visual design. That is simultaneously the film's greatest compliment and its most damning criticism, because a film is not a gallery. Images, however extraordinary, are not enough on their own. They require a story to carry them, characters to inhabit them, and logic to hold them together. But the images are extraordinary. And in a film that gives you so many reasons for frustration, it matters, genuinely, significantly matters, that every single time you look at the screen, what you see is worth looking at. And nowhere is the visual ambition of Army of the Dead more concentrated or more conceptually fascinating than in its boldest creative decision: the alpha zombies. The idea that the undead of Las Vegas are not merely a horde, but a civilization, with a king, with a queen, with emotions, hierarchies, and something that might, if you look closely enough, resemble love. It is one of the most interesting ideas in recent zombie cinema. Whether the film does it justice is a very different question. Every genre, at some point in its evolution, reaches a ceiling. Not a ceiling of quality great work can always be created within established conventions, but a ceiling of surprise. A point where the foundational rules of the genre have been so thoroughly explored, so completely mapped, so exhaustively repeated across decades of films, television, and literature, that the audience arrives already knowing the territory, already knowing the rules, already, on some level, knowing what comes next. The zombie genre reached that ceiling a long time ago. Since George Romero established the grammar of the modern undead film in 1968, the genre has worked variations on a remarkably consistent set of rules. The dead rise, they hunger, they spread. They do not think, do not feel, do not remember what they once were. They are not people anymore. They are the absence of people, wearing the bodies of people. And that specific horror, the familiar made monstrous, is what the genre has always traded in. Those rules have been stretched. They have been accelerated. The fast-moving zombie of the early 2000s was a real evolution, and an effective one. They have been satirized, sentimentalized, politicized, romanticized, but the core grammar has largely remained intact. Army of the Dead looks at that grammar and asks a question that is, on its face, one of the most interesting questions the zombie genre has asked in years. What if they remember? What if, somewhere in the process of infection and transformation, something remains? Not the full complexity of human consciousness, but something. An echo. A residue. A residue. What if the undead of Las Vegas are not merely animated bodies driven by instinct, but creatures who have developed or retained the capacity for something resembling thought? For hierarchy, for loyalty, for territory, for loss, for love, because that is what Army of the Dead is proposing. Not subtly, not metaphorically, but directly and explicitly. The alpha zombies, a distinct class of undead who sit at the top of the Las Vegas horde's social structure, are intelligent. They are strategic. They communicate. They organize. They have established a kingdom, with a king and queen at its center, and that kingdom operates according to rules, rules of territory, rules of engagement, rules about what constitutes a violation worthy of retaliation. And the queen, the Alpha King's queen, is pregnant. I want to give that detail the space it deserves, because it is genuinely startling. A pregnant zombie, not as a throwaway detail, not as a visual joke, as a plot point with direct narrative consequences. The implications of that single idea are enormous, philosophically, biologically, dramatically. If an alpha zombie can carry a child, then whatever these creatures are, they are not simply the walking dead. They are something new, something that has moved beyond the binary of living and undead into a third category the genre has rarely explored. That is not a small idea. That is a large idea. A bold idea. The kind of idea that, handled with the seriousness and creative commitment it demands, could redefine what a zombie film is capable of doing. Let's be clear about something, because it matters. The ambition here is real. Whatever reservations you may have about the execution, and we are going to get to those reservations in detail, The conceptual swing Army of the Dead takes with its alpha mythology deserves genuine acknowledgement. This is a film that looked at a genre with 50 years of established convention behind it and said, we are going to add something genuinely new, not a variation, not a refinement, something structurally different. Something that asks the audience to reconsider what they think they know about what a zombie is. In a genre landscape where novelty is increasingly rare, that ambition has value. The willingness to reach, even if the reach exceeds the grasp, is always more interesting than the safety of mere competence. The idea of a zombie civilization is, frankly, fascinating. The idea that Las Vegas, a city that even in its living form operated according to its own strange internal logic, its own rituals, hierarchies, and codes of conduct, has now been replaced by a zombie civilization that mirrors and distorts those same qualities, is exactly the kind of thematic richness that separates memorable genre filmmaking from forgettable genre filmmaking. The Alphas have claimed the casinos. They've established territories. They have rituals. They have, in some sense, continued the project of Las Vegas, the project of building a world apart, a world governed by rules that exist nowhere else, under entirely new management. That is genuinely interesting. That deserves a genuinely interesting film built around it. And here is where the disappointment arrives. Not with a bang, with a slow, accumulating, finally undeniable realization that the film is not going to do what it could have done with this idea. That it is going to gesture toward the mythology rather than fully inhabit it. That it is going to use the alphas as dramatic furniture, as obstacles, antagonists, and visual spectacle, without committing to exploring what they actually mean. The Alpha King and his queen are presented with considerable visual authority. Their design is striking. Their presence is genuinely imposing. In their scenes, they carry a dark, unsettling dignity that makes them some of the most cinematically compelling figures in the film. When the king moves through his territory, when the queen's pregnancy becomes a plot point, when the alphas demonstrate tactical intelligence by setting and triggering a trap in those moments, the mythology is alive. The idea is working. The promise is visible, and then the film looks away. The intelligence of the alphas is applied with a consistency that can only be described as convenient. In scenes where tactical sophistication serves the plot, the alphas are terrifyingly smart, coordinated, strategic, capable of a kind of military precision that makes them formidable opponents. In scenes where that intelligence would complicate the action, they revert, without explanation or acknowledgement, to behavior closer to standard genre convention. They are nearly unstoppable right up until the moment the plot requires a simple defeat. They are emotionally aware right up until the moment that awareness would demand a dramatic response the film is unwilling to provide. This inconsistency is not merely a plot issue, it is a symptom of something more fundamental. It tells you the alpha mythology was designed from the outside and rather than the inside out. That someone correctly recognized smart zombies as an interesting concept, then worked backward to use them where convenient, without first establishing the internal logic that would make their behavior feel coherent and earned. Strong world building works from the inside out. It establishes the rules first, then dramatizes the consequences of those rules. The mythology of Army of the Dead works from the outside in. It places interesting elements in interesting positions and trusts that their visual impact will substitute for the logical foundation that should be supporting them. It doesn't, not fully, not consistently enough. Nowhere is this clearer than in the treatment of the Queen's pregnancy. On paper, this is the single most dramatically potent element of the alpha mythology. A pregnant zombie is not just a visual surprise, it is a thematic statement. It suggests that whatever these creatures are, they are not simply death in motion. They carry within them the possibility of continuation, of something new entering the world. And given that the film's other major emotional concern, the one we will address fully when discussing the father-daughter relationship, is family, inheritance, and what parents leave behind for their children, the resonance is obvious. It is right there. The zombie king and queen are, in their own monstrous way, parents, awaiting the arrival of something they cannot fully understand in a world already transformed beyond recognition, in a city claimed and reshaped into something it was never meant to be. There is a parallel to Scott Ward and his daughter that practically writes itself. two fathers, two daughters, two forms of parental love expressed across the divide between the living and the dead. That parallel is never drawn. The pregnancy is introduced, used as a plot mechanism to heighten third-act stakes, and then resolved without the emotional or thematic weight it had earned. The film had, in that detail alone, everything it needed to make the alpha mythology emotionally resonant, to transform it from an interesting genre innovation into something meaningful. It chose not to use it. There is, to be fair, one sequence involving the alpha mythology that does work, that briefly and imperfectly achieves something close to what the concept was always reaching for. The death of the zombie queen creates, in the Alpha King, a response that is unmistakably grief. Not the rage of a territorial creature whose partner has fallen. Grief, the heavy, specific, inconsolable quality of loss that only beings capable of love can feel. In that moment, in the Alpha King standing over his queen, in the stillness that overtakes him, the idea of the emotional zombie is not merely described, it is shown, and it lands. It is one of the film's most unexpectedly affecting moments. And it works precisely because the design and performance commit to the emotion without hesitation, without undercutting it with irony or spectacle. For one brief, genuine moment, the mythology justifies itself entirely, which makes the film's failure to build more consistently toward that moment even more frustrating. The emotional power was always available. The path toward it was always visible. The film simply did not travel far enough or often enough to make the destination feel fully earned. The alpha zombie concept is, without question, the most intellectually ambitious element of Army of the Dead. It is also the element that most clearly illustrates the film's central defining issue, the gap between the ambition of its ideas and the discipline of their execution. The idea is genuinely great. A zombie civilization governed by rules, shaped by emotion, led by creatures capable of love, loss, and continuation. That is the foundation of a film that could have been extraordinary. That could have said something new, true, and lasting about what zombie fiction can explore. What Army of the Dead delivers instead is a film that uses that foundation to build something smaller than it deserved. The alphas are impressive. The mythology is interesting. The moments where the concept fully ignites are genuinely powerful. But they are moments, not a sustained argument. They are glimpses of a film that could have existed, visible through the gaps in the film that actually does. The grammar of zombie cinema has been waiting a long time for someone to break it open and discover what lies inside. Army of the Dead came closer than almost anything before it, and then it stopped just short. And speaking of ideas that deserved far more development, there is one detail in Army of the Dead that has generated more bewildered discussion than almost anything else in the film. Something the camera notices, acknowledges, and then simply moves on from, as if it were nothing. As if an entire second mythology had just been casually introduced and immediately abandoned. We are talking, of course, about the robot zombies. I need to talk about the robot zombies. I know, but we have to. Because they are there. They are absolutely, undeniably right there in the film. And the movie treats them with such complete casualness, such total indifference, that it raises a question somehow both absurd and entirely legitimate. Did Zack Snyder just forget that he put robot zombies in his movie? Let me step back. Because before we get to the robots specifically, and we are absolutely going to get to the robots, we need to establish the broader context. Because the robot zombies do not exist in isolation. They are the most extreme expression of a pattern running through the entire creature mythology of Army of the Dead. A pattern of introduction without development of ideas deployed without infrastructure. Of a filmmaker reaching into a hat full of fascinating concepts and scattering them across the screen without stopping to ask whether any of them connect. We have already talked about the alphas, the intelligent, emotional, hierarchical undead who represent the film's most ambitious creative swing. And we have already noted that even the alphas, for all their conceptual richness, are handled with frustrating inconsistency that prevents the mythology from fully cohering. But the alphas, at least, are central. They are woven into the plot. They have names, histories, motivations, however lightly explored. They are characters, in a sense. The rest of the creature mythology in Army of the Dead is something else entirely. It is a catalog of extraordinary ideas that appear, register briefly, and then disappear. Never referenced, never explained, never integrated into the story in any meaningful way. It is world building as decoration. mythology as wallpaper, the creative equivalent of constructing an architectural marvel and then covering every wall with fascinating paintings that have no relationship to one another or to the building they hang inside. Let us take stock. Let us carefully, methodically, take stock of what Army of the Dead introduces into its zombie mythology and then declines to explain. There are the sleeping zombies, a genuinely unsettling concept. Undead creatures in a dormant state, piled in heaps through which the crew must move in complete silence. The idea that zombies sleep immediately raises fascinating questions. Do they dream? What triggers dormancy? And what triggers awakening? Is it a survival mechanism? A sign of something approaching a biological cycle? Is this a stage of infection or a separate behavioral category? The film does not say. The sleeping zombies are used effectively for one tense sequence. Then they are left behind, along with every question they create. There are the rain-activated zombies, dried, desiccated figures lying inert in desert conditions, only to reactivate when touched by water. Again, genuinely interesting. Again, raising immediate questions about the biology of the infection, about environmental conditions governing behavior, about implications for containment and survival. Again, not a single word of explanation. The concept appears, serves one dramatic moment, and is never meaningfully mentioned again. There are the martial artist zombies, undead figures who fight with a level of precision and technique suggesting retained muscle memory, skill, training that somehow survived transformation, which is an extraordinary idea. The notion that the body remembers what the mind has lost, that physical mastery could remain after identity has faded. That concept opens dramatic possibilities the film seems entirely uninterested in pursuing. And then there are the robot zombies. I want to be precise here because precision matters when discussing something this bewildering. At several points in Army of the Dead, observant viewers will notice figures among the horde that do not move, decay, or behave like organic creatures. Figures carrying the specific, uncanny quality of mechanical constructs. Synthetic entities, robots wearing or imitating zombie bodies, moving through the horde with the subtly unnatural quality of something built rather than born. They are not a hallucination. They are not a trick of the light. Multiple viewers across multiple rewatches have identified them, noted them, documented them. They are there. And the film that placed them there, that made the creative decision to include synthetic zombie-like entities in its world, never acknowledges them, never explains them, never returns to them, never uses them as a plot point, reveal, mystery, threat, or question. They simply exist, in the background, unexplained, unaddressed, as if someone on the production team made a creative decision of staggering implication and then forgot to include the scene explaining what it meant. Now, at this point, a reasonable person might reasonably ask, does this actually matter? In a film with this many loose ends, this many unanswered questions, this much narrative looseness, does the presence of unexplained robot zombies represent a meaningful critical issue, or is it simply one more piece of the film's broad, cheerful disregard for internal logic? I would argue, and I want to make this carefully, because it is not merely a complaint about continuity, that it matters enormously. Not because the robots themselves are important, but because of what their presence reveals about the film's relationship with its own ideas. The robot zombies are not an accident. They were not accidentally included. Someone designed them, someone built them, someone placed them in those scenes deliberately, which means that at some point in the development of Army of the Dead, there was a plan. There was a thread of narrative or thematic logic connecting those synthetic figures to something larger, to a story explaining their existence, their purpose, their significance inside the world of the film. That story, whatever it was, is not in the finished movie. It was removed, abandoned, or deferred to a sequel that may or may not ever arrive. And what remains? The robots themselves, stranded in the background of scenes whose foreground has moved on without them, is evidence of a creative process generating ideas faster than it could contain or develop them. This is, in miniature, the story of Army of the Dead as a whole. The film did not suffer from a shortage of ideas. It suffered from an excess of them, an abundance so complete, so enthusiastically undisciplined, that the finished product feels less like one coherent vision and more like the first draft of 5 different films edited together into one movie that is somehow both too long and deeply incomplete. Think about what is actually in this film. You have a zombie heist. You have a father-daughter reconciliation story. You have a betrayal thriller. You have a mythology about intelligent, emotional zombies building a civilization. You have robot zombies hinting at a synthetic intelligence angle the film never explores. You have a sleeping zombie ecosystem. You have rain-activated undead. You have a pregnant zombie queen carrying thematic implications the film never unpacks. You have a zombie tiger. You have a zombie horse. You have zombie martial artists. You have political commentary about outsiders and the exploitation of vulnerable people. You have a mystery about what Bly Tanaka actually wants from inside the quarantine zone. Any one of these elements, any single one of them, could anchor an entire film, could serve as the central premise around which a coherent, developed, dramatically satisfying story is built. In Army of the Dead, all of them exist simultaneously, competing for space, each underdeveloped in direct proportion to how many others are sharing the frame with it. The result is a mythology so overcrowded and so lightly explained that it does not feel like a world. It feels like a pitch document, a list of ideas someone intended to develop and either ran out of time or discipline to fully develop. There is a defense of all this, and it is one the film's supporters have offered with real conviction. Army of the Dead was designed as the first entry in a franchise. The robot zombies, the unanswered mythology questions, the threads that go nowhere. These are not failures of development. They are intentional seeds, deliberate mysteries planted for sequels, prequels, and spin-offs that would eventually provide the answers the original film withholds. This is a reasonable argument. It is also, I think, ultimately an insufficient one. A film that withholds explanation as deliberate mystery must, at minimum, signal that the withholding is intentional. It must give the audience enough structure to understand they are watching the opening movement of a larger story, not the remains of an underdeveloped one. The robot zombies in Army of the Dead do not feel like a carefully planted mystery. They feel like a detail that was meant to matter and then got lost in the edit. There is a difference, and audiences feel that difference even when they cannot always articulate it. The difference is intentionality, and the texture of intentionality is visible on screen. Deliberate mystery has the quality of controlled incompleteness. You sense the shape of what is being withheld even as it is withheld. Accidental incompleteness feels entirely different. It feels like something missing rather than something hidden. And the robot zombies in Army of the Dead have the texture of something missing. Here is what I find most interesting about the robot zombie issue, and about the broader pattern of unexplained mythology it represents. It tells you something genuinely revealing about Zack Snyder as a creative mind. Because the problem is not a lack of imagination. The robot zombies, the sleeping undead, the rain-activated creatures, the martial artist infected, these come from a genuinely fertile imagination. An imagination generating ideas at a rate that would be extraordinary in any filmmaker. An imagination that looks at an established genre and immediately, almost compulsively, begins asking, but what if we also had this, and this, and this? The problem is the discipline imagination requires in order to become a story rather than a catalog, the editorial function, the willingness to choose, to develop, to follow one strong idea far enough to discover everything inside it rather than accumulating many ideas and leaving all of them only partially explored. Army of the Dead is a film made by someone with too many ideas and not enough patience to finish any of them, which is, in its own way, a more interesting creative failure than a film made by someone with no ideas at all. A film with no ideas is simply empty. A film with too many ideas is a tragedy you can see in every abandoned thread and every unexplained detail, the outline of the extraordinary film it was always within reach of becoming. The robot zombies are standing in the background of that tragedy. Patient, unexplained, waiting for a scene that never came. Now. We have spent the last several minutes talking about the elements of Army of the Dead's creature mythology that did not work, the ideas introduced and abandoned, the threads that went nowhere, the potential left unused. So let's talk about the one element of this film's creature design that worked so completely, so immediately, and so memorably that even some of the film's harshest critics pause their arguments to acknowledge it. Let's talk about the zombie tiger. There are moments in cinema, rare moments, genuinely rare, where a film delivers something so perfectly, so completely, so far beyond what you had any right to expect, that it stops feeling like a movie for a second and becomes something closer to a shared hallucination. A moment where the entire audience, regardless of what they thought of everything that came before, regardless of what reservations they carried into the theater, is suddenly, unanimously, completely on board. Army of the Dead has one of those moments. It has, and I say this without qualification, without irony, and without reservation, one of the greatest single creature introductions in the history of the zombie genre, possibly in the history of monster movies, full stop. And it arrives in the form of a large, black and white, magnificently rendered, deeply intimidating, completely iconic zombie tiger. Let's sit with the concept for a moment, because it deserves that. A zombie tiger, not a metaphorical tiger, not a tiger glimpsed briefly at a distance, not a tiger used once for a cheap scare and then discarded. A zombie tiger, an undead apex predator, rendered with real craft and complete commitment, whose presence in this film is so immediately, viscerally, overwhelmingly correct that you briefly wonder why every zombie film in the history of the genre did not think of it first. The logic of it is elegant in its simplicity. If a zombie outbreak happens in Las Vegas, a city with casinos, casinos with exotic animal attractions, and attractions with big cats, then some of those big cats would be infected. And an infected big cat, carrying the combination of apex predator physicality and undead relentlessness, is not a problem solved with a simple headshot and a steady breath. It is a problem requiring a complete reassessment of every survival strategy you thought you had. The zombie tiger does not merely add a new threat to the film's world. It reframes the world entirely. It says, the rules you brought in here do not apply. This is not the zombie film you thought it was. The first time we see the tiger in full, not the glimpse, not the suggestion, but the complete, unobscured, breath-catching reveal, is one of the most carefully orchestrated creature introductions I can remember in recent blockbuster filmmaking. Everything about it is calibrated. The sound arrives before the image, that low, resonant vibration somewhere between a growl and something deeper, something felt as much in the chest as heard in the ears. The camera finds the shape before the details, a mass of movement in darkness, large enough to immediately reset your sense of scale, moving with a fluid, unhurried grace more unsettling than any amount of aggressive roaring would have been. And then the light catches it, and you see it clearly. And the film pauses, just for a fraction of a second, just long enough for you to absorb what you were looking at before the chaos begins. The design is extraordinary. The decision to render the zombie tiger in black and white, desaturated, drained of the warm amber tones of a living tiger's coat, is a masterstroke of visual storytelling. It communicates the creature's status instantly, without a single line of exposition. This is not a tiger. This is what a tiger becomes. The familiar made alien, the majestic made monstrous. The beauty is still there, the physical perfection of the big cat form, the musculature, the movement. But it has been transformed into something serving an entirely different purpose. Something that no longer hunts from instinct or territorial need, but because the infection drives it and because it no longer has any alternative. It is beautiful and terrible in equal measure. And the film is smart enough in these sequences, at least, to let you feel both emotions at the same time. Now, the CGI. Because it would be dishonest to discuss the zombie tiger without addressing the technical question of how convincingly it is rendered. And the honest answer is, convincingly enough that it stops mattering, and in many moments, considerably more convincingly than that. The tiger's movement is the key. CGI creatures succeed or fail based on movement, whether the physics of the body feel consistent with the weight and musculature the creature appears to possess. A digital animal whose movement does not match its apparent mass becomes immediately unconvincing, no matter how detailed the surface rendering may be. The zombie tiger moves correctly. Its stride carries weight. Its acceleration feels believable. Its transitions from stillness to motion, from motion to attack, carry the specific quality of a creature whose physical systems are working in the right sequence and proportion. That is harder to achieve than it sounds. The team responsible for the animation clearly studied real big cat movement with care, and the result is a creature your body believes even when your rational mind knows you are watching a digital creation. That is the standard. That is what successful CGI creature work looks like, and the zombie tiger meets it. The film gives the tiger several scenes, and each is worth examining individually because each achieves something slightly different. Together, they form a compact argument for what Army of the Dead was always capable of when it fully committed to its strongest instincts. The introduction sequence, which we already discussed, establishes the creature's physical authority and the specific kind of threat it represents. It is a scene about scale and recalibrated expectations. You thought you understood what kind of film this was. You didn't. The later sequence in which the tiger is used, almost casually, almost effortlessly, as a trap set against the crew by the Alpha King, is something else entirely. It reframes the tiger retroactively, taking it from standalone spectacle and integrating it into the broader world of the film. The tiger is not merely a creature. It is an asset, deployed by a leader who understands that the most effective weapon is the one your enemy never planned for. That scene is one of the smartest pieces of plotting in the entire film, and it only works because the tiger had already been established as something the audience fears on a visceral level. And then there is the attack sequence. The zombie tiger's most memorable moment, the scene lodged in the minds of nearly everyone who watched this movie, regardless of what they thought of the rest of it, is something I won't describe in full detail because some moments are better experienced than narrated. But I will say this, it is one of the most committed, unapologetically intense, wildly over-the-top creature moments in recent blockbuster cinema. It is exactly as aggressive as it needs to be. It is staged with a directorial confidence suggesting Zack Snyder knew exactly what he had in this moment and was determined to honor it with the full weight of his craft. The slow motion is fully justified here. The framing is sharp. The sound design is outstanding. And the practical and digital elements combine so smoothly that you stop thinking in technical categories altogether. You are not watching CGI interact with a set. You are watching something that feels real, terrifying, and magnificent, and you cannot look away. This is, in miniature, everything Army of the Dead was supposed to be across its full runtime: committed, visceral, visually bold, completely, unapologetically itself. But here is the detail. The small, nearly throwaway detail that elevates the zombie tiger from a great creature to something closer to a cinematic personality. In the film's third act, during a sequence of rising tension and escalating chaos, the camera catches the zombie tiger doing something no one expects. It yawns. Not a threatening display, not a roar disguised as a yawn, a genuine, full-bodied, completely unimpressed yawn. The universal body language of a creature that has decided nothing happening around it particularly deserves attention. The chaos of the third act, the conflict, the desperation, the stakes, the zombie tiger regards all of it with the magnificent indifference of an apex predator that knows nothing nearby represents a serious challenge. It is one of the funniest moments in the film. It is also, unexpectedly, one of the most character-rich moments in the film because it tells you something specific and delightful about this creature's personality that no amount of threatening behavior could communicate. The zombie tiger is not merely dangerous, it is bored. It is an undead apex predator in a world full of lesser threats, and it has the confidence to let that fact show. That yawn is the kind of detail great filmmaking creates, the kind of detail that appears almost effortlessly when a creative team is fully invested in what they are making. It is the kind of detail that belongs in a better film. It is the kind of detail that makes you briefly, sharply sad that it is in this one instead. Here is something worth noting. The critical response to Army of the Dead is, as we have established and will continue to establish, deeply divided. There are genuine supporters and genuine detractors, and the distance between their positions is wide. On the zombie tiger, there is almost no division. Nearly every reviewer, positive, negative, and everything in between, acknowledges it, praises it, wishes there had been more of it. The film's harshest critics, in the middle of detailed critiques of its failures, paused to note that the zombie tiger is exceptional. That kind of consensus is rare. It is the critical equivalent of an audience falling silent at a concert, not because they are disengaged, but because something on stage has demanded their full, involuntary attention. What that consensus tells you is not merely that the zombie tiger is a strong piece of filmmaking. It tells you something about what the entire film could have been. The zombie tiger is the film's potential made visible, the proof that the creative team had within them the ability to create something genuinely memorable and lasting. The question is why that capacity was deployed so completely in these specific sequences and so inconsistently everywhere else. The zombie tiger is not an accident of an uneven film getting lucky. It is a glimpse of the great film that was always somewhere inside this one, visible for a few glorious minutes before the larger, messier, more frustrating version closed back around it. I want to close this segment with something simple and sincere. The zombie tiger of Army of the Dead is one of my favorite creature creations in recent cinema. Not because it is technically flawless, it isn't quite. Not because it is surrounded by a film worthy of it, it isn't entirely. But because it represents, in concentrated form, the quality that makes genre filmmaking worth caring about, the willingness to commit. To take a genuinely strange idea, a black and white undead big cat prowling the ruins of Las Vegas, and pursue it with complete seriousness, complete craft, and complete creative conviction. To not hedge, to not apologize, to not undercut it with irony or self-awareness. To simply say, this is real, this is here, and it is going to be magnificent. More of that. From this film, from this director, from all of us, more zombie tigers, more commitment, more craft, more willingness to look at an absurd idea and say yes, all the way, no half measures. The zombie tiger did not save Army of the Dead, but it reminded us, every time it appeared on screen, of what saving would have looked like. And that brings us to what might be the film's single most frustrating missed opportunity of all. Not a character left underwritten. Not a plot thread that led nowhere. But a place. A setting so extraordinary, so uniquely suited to this story, that its treatment in this film borders on creative negligence. We are talking about Las Vegas itself, and the question of why a film set in the most theatrical city on Earth never once fully allowed that city to become part of its story.